welcome Susanna Fogel to Thinking Aloud. Susanna is a director, screenwriter, and novelist. She recently wrapped production on Cat Person, a thriller adaptation of the viral New Yorker story for Studio Canal. Previously, she co-wrote the hit comedy Booksmart, for which she was nominated for a BAFTA and a WGA award, and directed and co-wrote Lionsgate's The Spy Who Dumped Me and Magnolia Pictures' Life Partners, which she developed at the Sundance Lab. Her upcoming projects include Winner, a biopic of millennial whistleblower reality winner. On the television side, Susanna most recently directed the pilot episode of the acclaimed HBO Max series, The Flight Attendant, for which she won a DGA award and was nominated for an Emmy. She also directed the pilot of the Amazon series The Wilds, episodes of Gillian Flynn's remake of Utopia, and an installment of Steven Spielberg's Amazing Stories. Susanna is also an avid writer of satire, whose pieces have been featured in The New Yorker. Her first novel, Nuclear Family, was published by Macmillan in 2017. And we are sitting here today because Susanna directed the pilot episode and several other episodes in the series A Small Light that's now available in Disney Plus and Hulu. A Small Light is based on an inspiring true story of Miep Gies, who was a young, carefree, and opinionated at a time when opinions got you killed, when Otto Frank asked her to help hide his family from the Nazis during World War II. Told with a modern sensibility, A Small Light shakes the cobwebs off history and makes Miep's story more relevant than ever, forcing audiences to ask themselves what they would have done in Miep's shoes, and in modern times asking if they would have the courage to stand up to hatred themselves. Some stood by, Miep stood up. It is released by National Geographic and Disney Plus. The powerful 8-part limited series is produced by ABC Signature and Keshet Studios. It's my pleasure to welcome Susanna to Valley Beth Shalom. Contractually, I'm supposed to raise my mug at this point to show you that, and this is my Valley Beth Shalom Day School mug, which I proudly support. So, Susanna, thank you very much for joining us. I saw the series last night. It is a powerful retelling of the Anne Frank narrative from a different perspective. We were talking, and it's almost like the Cobra Kai version of Anne Frank. Suddenly we see it from Miep's perspective. So when was the first time that you read The Diary of Anne Frank?
You asked me that a minute ago, and I was trying to remember. I know that I want to say that I was in junior high, probably about 13 or 14. It's hard to separate it from my awareness of Miep's story, which I also had some awareness of Miep because my mother lived in Holland, and also just being Jewish, you kind of hear about the characters on the periphery, but we happened to take a special interest in this Dutch woman just because we had, Dutch relatives. So I think I was probably around 14, Anne's age.
The reason I use the Cobra Kai analogy isn't because Miep was a bad guy or a complicated character or anything like that from our childhood. It's that when I started watching the story, we often don't think about the story from her perspective. We're taught the story from the Franks' perspective because we're supposed to relate to the Franks. It's such a powerful idea to try to think about it from Miep's perspective. So what was the genesis of your involvement in the project?
So Joan Rader and Tony Phelan, who are the creators of the show, who wrote the pilot, approached me with a pitch, like a full sort of layout of how the story of Miep's involvement went from the time that she was kind of coming of age before she came into the Franks' life, all the way through the end when she helped, find the diary, put it in Otto's hands, and then had a long relationship of activism and also close familial bonding with Otto in the wake of his family's deaths. So they had this whole story laid out and kind of performed it for me on a Zoom in the middle of COVID. And I was so moved and inspired by it, and also really struck by how much kind of humor and warmth and emotion and life was in their telling of the story. And in particular, what they were focusing on in Miep's perspective, which was one of complexity. And she's a person who was a bystander, but then chose not to be, but didn't have to participate, but did. And it felt like a really nuanced, messy, interesting, like a celebration of humanity, but also an interesting way into telling this story about a time period where we often we really often define people that experience that time in terms of their relationship to the Holocaust in particular. Like, you're either a victim of the Holocaust, you are a villain in the Holocaust. But she was sort of a person who chose to take an active role in allyship, which was just interesting. It was putting the focus in a slightly different place in a way that felt really refreshing and also relevant to all of our global issues that continue to pervade not just anti-Semitism, but all of the nationalism that's going on now, and the state of our world. Won't get into that. That's for another Zoom. Anyway, they told me this story, and I wanted to be part of the pitching of the show. So together we developed this presentation, and we sort of trotted it around to different networks, and we're hoping to find the right home for it and the right group of people who would let us tell the story in exactly the way that they told it to me. And we were really impressed with Nat Geo's desire to do exactly what we wanted. So we then kind of made a deal with them, and Joan and Tony went off and wrote, and I was sort of helping them just develop the story that they had in their heads for so long. So I was involved in the very early pitching stages of the series, and then all the way through to going to Prague with them and directing the first 3 episodes of the show.
So the show was shot in Prague.
Mostly in Prague, yeah. We did some Amsterdam for the exteriors and the other sort of very Amsterdam specific looks, but it's actually quite difficult to shoot there because the city it's like narrow roads and canals, and it's not really set up to have a lot of production vans, and nor should it be. Like, right. I don't need to ruin that city any further than the tourists and stoners already have. So most of it was Prague, yeah, and we recreated the annex as best we could on a stage, and we had this incredibly meticulous production designer who more or less completely reimagined or recreated it and transposed it onto this stage in Prague, which was wonderful. And then going back to the annex, when we were promoting the series after having shot in Prague, we went back on another tour of the Anne Frank house, and it was really eerie because we'd all spent the whole summer in more or less that same space, the same dimensions, the same paint colors, the same everything. And it was a really surreal, one of many surreal moments making the show. But yeah, we did a few weeks in Amsterdam just to sort of get some of that specificity there too.
What were some of the moments where you had to take a step back and really consider the subject matter? I mean, when you're making a show like this and the production designer starts painting swastikas on the brick outside of the building, or you start to portray the Nazis marching into Amsterdam for the first time, which was in episode 1. As a Jewish woman standing there directing this entire scene to try to bring it to life, what's going on inside of you?
There were so many moments making the series that were really surreal. And there were a lot of heavy, dramatic feelings that happened, but also the sort of bizarre moments of irony that cropped up were just as memorable. I'll just give a couple of examples. One was when Mark was painting the sets for some of the vandalized buildings at this facade in Prague. And it was the day before we were going to shoot the scene where they see that the ice cream shop has all this vandalism on it, anti-Semitic vandalism. And it was in Prague, which is, a city that like proudly defends Ukraine. And they're very, it's not a city that has as currently a problematic political position as some of those other countries and cities in the region do. So it was like a very liberal, progressive, accepting place by and large. And then there was a group of tourists that went by on segways, just touring Prague, and they happened to pass our giant wall of anti-Semitic writings. And there were production vans, and it was so clear to anybody that's ever been around a production that there was something being filmed there, but they were just random Segway tourists from England. And they're like, oh, is there a lot of anti-Semitism around here? Like, not knowing. And Mark, who has this wicked, dry British sense of humor, said, yep. And then they just rode away on their Segways. And it was just a moment of, we were all kind of laughing about it, but we're like, this is one of the many bizarre moments of trying to recreate this, and we all had to kind of laugh at how absurd that was for us to experience. But at the same time, when we were shooting, Prague was such a haven for Ukrainian refugees. We had Ukrainians working on our shoot, and there were so many parallels between the content of what we were shooting and what was going on in their current lives and their diaspora and all of that. And those moments were constantly affecting us too. So it was both an issue of being reminded of what it would have been like to live through that as a Jewish woman, and also being aware of all of the sort of persecution that's continuing on. And it was a lot of heady conversations a lot of the time, but also very bizarre, funny moments, like that group of British tourists on their segways, just having no idea what was going on. And the other moment that came to mind that was really intense was when we were shooting the razzia in Amsterdam, where all of these Jews are being arrested. A couple of people came out of their apartments who had actually survived razzias in that neighborhood during World War II. And they came to watch the filming. And one woman said, "This is the last time I saw my family, was in this neighborhood in an event like this. I watched my family get carted away and I never saw them again." And just the weight of having a person standing there, you're trying to like recreate something horrific as a director, which is already such a kind of fundamentally awkward thing to do, because you're trying to force people to like enact just unspeakable levels of horror and making them do it over and over. And it feels really kind of just uncomfortable. But what we found is that these people they were talking about how cathartic it was for them to watch this, which we thought it would re-traumatize them to watch it. They're like, "No, this is good for us. We're watching the story be told. We're watching people like do justice to it." They had some notes for us. They wanted to get their pictures taken with all of these extras who played Nazis. So we have these pictures of these two, like elderly Jewish people who went through the razzias, right, taking selfies with these like Nazi guards in uniform, and everyone's smiling. And it was, it was very surreal. A lot of experiences like that came up for us when we were shooting. So yeah.
The great irony is kind of the commonplace question of, those British Segway tourists, right, saying, is there a lot of anti-Semitism around here? And the answer being yes. And right, then total acceptance of them going along on their Segway. Because right, the irony is that was exactly the scene that all of that was created for, was yeah, for Miep and her friend. They come out of her birthday scene. They're walking down the street, and she looks at the friend looks at the vandalism. This is not ruining the series for anybody. And Miep says, "Isn't it awful that this is happening?" And her friend says, it's terrible, but she doesn't understand why Jews don't just eat at their own ice cream shops. Like, why, if they just stop breaking the law, then none of this would happen in the first place. And how quickly in the pilot we see like the world around Miep, right, begin to turn and shift its perspective from, Holland will stand against the Nazis to, this really isn't as bad as people made it out to be. Germany's involvement in Holland is not, it's not as bad as they imagined it. So I have to tell you from my perspective, and I know that this is probably, correct me if you're wrong, maybe this was your doing, but I didn't hear about it for the first time. I didn't hear about this series for the first time in anticipation of this interview. I heard about it actually from my children, who saw the advertisements on Disney Plus. Mm-hmm. And I actually think when I was watching the series that it's so crucial that Disney Plus released this. Yeah. Because this is exactly where the adolescent viewership that's supposed to watch this, they're already there and they're going to find it, as opposed to trying to convince people to go to a place where they're not going to see it, because there's so much noise in watching television and movies today, because it's all kind of dumped onto our TV in these apps. It's hard to find anything.
Yeah, I mean, that was part of what we thought about when we were figuring out who to partner with on the show. When you're selling something, you just want somebody to agree that the story is worth telling and that they're going to invest large sums of money in telling it. But each place you're pitching to has a slightly different identity and a slightly different, demographic target. And so you sort of take whatever the best offer is for the show. But part of that calculation for us is like, who's going to watch this if it's on HBO? Who's going to watch it if it's on Disney Plus? And the idea of making a piece of elevated prestige television for people that already are on, they're already on the right side of history. They already know about the Holocaust. They're already prepared to watch documentaries about it or shows. There's something, you can enter that canon, or you can put your series on Disney Plus where it's in every home, it's in every kid's home, including kids of people that are Holocaust deniers, or they don't know about it, or they're in states that are banning versions of the Diary of Anne Frank. It's really important to like get in those living rooms too. So, it wasn't even something that we knew was as good of a match as it was. And then in the period of time between first selling the show and the show coming out, the world has just drifted into more and more and more problematic spaces. And so it was like, oh, thank God thank God these were our partners, even more than we ever thought. Just if somebody stumbles on the show after they've watched a Star Wars show and they're like, what's this? And then they learn about it and then they Google it and then they are educating themselves. That is the point of it all, So yeah, Disney, it turned out to be the perfect place for the show in that way.
And the other piece of perfection, serendipity, I don't know how this happened, was I felt like the casting of Miep and the casting of Otto Frank as Liev Schreiber, I should say, as Otto Frank, because it's easy to look at the Franks and say they hid as an act of kind of weakness or an act of not knowing till the very end, or an act of, the show does an excellent job of showing that Otto Frank was constantly looking for avenues to save his family. He was not a weak character. It was out of strength that they went into hiding to try to save what was most special to him in the world. And he made the best choices available to him in a horrifying situation. And Miep made the most admirable choices in terms of humanity in the worst of situations. I just thought that the casting was fantastic. I don't know if you had a hand in that casting or not, but it was excellent.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting. It's like in all my work, it's interesting to me to find an actor who people don't necessarily have an opinion about what they are, what they do, or the limits of what they can do. So in the case of Liev, it was like, he's not the Otto Frank that we're used to seeing. We're used to seeing like a sort of a more of a beta male, frail, kind of like sweet dad, because in Anne's diary, she knew him as her dad. And so how well do you know your dad? You only know your dad as much as your dad's willing to show you as your dad. So there's a lot he's keeping for himself, like his work issues, his marital stuff, his all of the things that make him like a complete person were not in Anne's diary because she didn't know them. So for us, it was like exploring the other sides of Otto and knowing that he was such a strong person who, basically built this fortress in the annex for his family for months and months before he moved them there. I mean, that's like the ultimate display of like strength and forethought and steadfastness. And there are all these things about Otto that are qualities that are just shades of him that we aren't used to seeing, because we know him either through Anne's diary or as the man who sort of made a career out of promoting like Holocaust education through the diary. So like he's tied into this narrative of the victimhood that he experienced losing his family. So that's how we know him. We don't know him as the man before all of this happened. So we wanted somebody who could bring those shades to it. And Liev has such a strong presence and such a kind of like a masculine alpha kind of thing that even when he plays a really restrained character, there's like a lot of multitudes there. So we wanted that because it's just not a version of Otto that we're used to seeing, just that complete person through the perspective of a peer, coworker, another adult, basically in Miep. And then Bel Pally was really interesting for Miep. I mean, just coincidentally, she happens to be Jewish, which was kind of it made her very familiar with the story to begin with and really connected to it. But we also liked the idea that, yeah, she's playing an ally, she's also a Jewish woman. And we're like, I don't know, just the level of her emotional connection to the series was really profound. But also she has this ability to just be to seem like the person that you want to have as your best friend. And that's really, she's aspirational, but not because she's perfect. She's also like flawed and charismatic. And even when she's being annoying, stubborn, and ambivalent, she's still likable. So that's sort of what we wanted. We wanted to be able to show that Miep's acts of dignity and heroism were not this like pristine thing. She was having doubts, insecurities, fears. She wasn't always making the right choices. She wasn't always handling her marriage the right way. You know, she's just a real person, which to us was really important because, you know, if we see these like sort of perfect, idealized forms of doing the right thing, if we can't relate to that because we're like, oh, this seems really hard, I don't know that I would do everything the right way, so I don't relate to this person, then we kind of distance ourselves from the story. But if we're watching a character who has all the doubts and fears and flaws that we do, then we're like, oh, okay, I can still do something and it still can be hugely profound, even if I'm also, you know, not washing the dishes and getting in fights with my mom, you know, all of it.
I thought the series does an incredible job of actually portraying how messy life was for so many people during that period. And at the same time, I was not expecting, I don't think anybody is expecting Ray Donovan to play Otto Frank.
That's what I mean, you know?
And it was the first time that at the very end of that first episode, when he sits down with Miep and asks her, explains to her that he has this idea, and he explains he's been trying to get his family out of Europe. Perhaps it's time to help his family disappear within Europe. You realize it came from a place of strength and it came from a place of love. And I've never seen that kind of portrayal of Otto Frank before. So thank you very much for doing that. So Susanna, let me ask you, how did you grow up? How would you discuss your own Jewish identity?
Let's see. My parents were both Jewish, both Reform. And they were also like ex Berkeley hippie types. So I grew up in Rhode Island going to this every Friday night, this thing called Friday Group, which is this really hippie, crunchy, stonery, professory version of being Jewish, where you sing songs and like the parents talk about, you know, their PhDs and the kids run around and whatever. It was wonderful. I think that like the religious aspect of it was part of it. The community aspect of it was dominant. So, you know, there would be some high holy days things, there would be Passover, but it was primarily just a gathering of Jewish families in New England, where we were a minority, but also it was an academic lefty environment. So it wasn't a place where I experienced a feeling of being a minority in a way that would have been really traumatizing. So anyway, I would say, yeah, Reform, culturally Jewish. My parents got divorced, and then my mom became much more of an avid temple goer. Like the temple became her main social outlet at that point, which I think happens to a lot of people as they get older. They really come to appreciate the community, even if they didn't before, on a purely spiritual level. So that's sort of the level of Jewish, you know, that I grew up with, but also being like a comedy person, going to college in New York City and then moving to LA, it's like a large majority of my friends are like other Jewish people who grew up the same level of observant, but now we all have Passover every year. And, you know, so that level, if that answers your question.
No, it's great. And how do you think making this series has impacted your Jewish identity?
Well, I think in recent years, I think as the world has gotten crazier, or maybe it was always this crazy, but as we've all gotten older and less insulated from sort of the harsh realities of the world, like a lot of us, you know, going through COVID, all of these moments that make you kind of question, like, what am I doing here? What's my community? What's my identity? Everyone's gotten like a little bit more spiritual in a way. So I think my group of friends who were, you know, just sort of Passover only Jews, have now become like a little bit more dialed into that. And I think that's true of me as well. But working on this show felt really important, yeah, it felt important. If I did feel like a calling to do it, it was not just that it was contributing to conversations about, um, nationalism and all the problematic political rumblings that are going on. It wasn't just a this show is relevant now thing, or a I should do this so my grandmother sees me do this before she dies thing, although that also factored in. Um, but yeah, it felt like, okay, this is something really important that feels like deeply part of my identity to be part of. Especially if I can bring an entertaining sensibility to this topic that's so often done in this very sepia way. That seems like something that a good use of my skill set as a storyteller. So
Well,
yeah.
Susanna, I want to thank you for bringing a small light to the world. And quite literally, the series Small Light, and figuratively, thank you for bringing more light into the world by allowing us maybe a glimpse into Miep's inner decision-making, her inner courage, and her inner light herself. You are always welcome to visit us here at Valley Beth Shalom, and talk to adults and or kids about creative writing and the creative process and everything. I think that would be an amazing program in person when you have time. So
I would love to do that. That sounds great. It's the best part of well, not the best part, but a part of this show that's been really wonderful actually is this press part of it, where you get to do interviews and talk about these things, and then also meet with temples. And I spoke at the Museum of Tolerance. That was really incredible. Like, I've never had a project where putting it out into the world is filled with so many deep, profound connections with people that have experienced the thing. And I don't know, it's been really community building for me just to put the show out there and have conversations like this. So thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome, and I look forward to meeting in person.
Yeah, me too.
I hope to see you soon.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching.